I ran the kennel rounds at Varen's Reach for 6 years before anyone off the moon ever heard of Scout. And even then, it wasn't because of anything he did. It was because of what he didn't do. Varen's Reach is a supply depot bolted to a mining rock that doesn't have a real name in any language I speak. Just a string of coalition survey numbers nobody uses out loud. Terran Auxiliary Corps runs the loading ramp and the kennel block under contract, moving ore crates and ration pallets between the Ilmar work gangs and whatever haulers docked that week. The Ilmar are small, segmented, patient people who do not complain, which I've come to understand is not the same as not having anything to complain about. Their labor quotas are set by a Corvain administrator named Kess, and Kess ran that moon the way some men run a poker table, by making sure everyone at it was afraid to fold. I had 4 dogs on rotation that season, 2 Malinois for perimeter, a young lab who was still learning not to eat packing foam, and Scout, who by then was 11 years old, and mostly there because nobody had the heart to retire him. He was a Border Collie, black and white going gray at the muzzle, and he had one working speed for everything, unhurried. He didn't run a room. He watched it, the way he used to watch sheep back wherever his line started, waiting for the one that was about to break from the flock so he could put himself between it and trouble before it happened. That's a herding instinct, not a war instinct. Nobody explained that difference to Kess, and it turned out not to matter. It was a Tuesday by ship's clock when Kess came down to the ramp himself. He didn't usually. He had people for that. But the third shift Ilmar crew had fallen behind quota, 2 cycles running, and word was, he wanted to be seen fixing it personally, which on Varen's Reach meant being seen making an example. I was at the kennel gate with Scout off leash, doing nothing more dramatic than checking his feet for grit, when Kess's transport set down at the ramp head with 2 armed Corvain guards behind him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just started walking the line of loading stations, and the Ilmar crew went still, the way small animals go still, hoping stillness reads as absence. He stopped at the slowest station and said something short to the lead worker, a thin gray Ilmar named Sen Grays I'd traded ration bars with more than once. I didn't catch every word. I caught enough, a threat about the crew's water allotment, phrased as a question so it wouldn't look like one on the record. The rest of the Ilmar crew, 40-some of them, started backing off their stations toward the open apron near the kennel gate, the way you'd expect frightened people to bunch when there's nowhere else to go, and someone with authority is walking toward you slowly on purpose. Scout lifted his head off my boot and looked at the crowd the way he looked at a flock that was about to scatter wrong. I said his name once, Scout, not a command, just checking where his attention had gone. He walked out past the gate, unhurried, tail low and easy, and put himself at the near edge of the crowd, not between them and Kess, nothing that dramatic, just at the edge, the position he'd have taken with sheep bunching toward a fence line. He sat down. He looked at Kess. That's the whole event. An old dog sat down and looked at a man. Scout didn't growl. He didn't bare a tooth. His ears were up, his weight even, his mouth closed and relaxed. The exact posture I'd trained into him a decade ago for holding a flock steady without pressure. To anyone who's worked a herding dog, it reads as the calmest thing in the world. To anyone who hasn't, it reads as something else entirely. The Ilmar crew stopped moving. Not because Scout told them to. Ilmar don't take instruction from dogs any more than dogs take instruction from Ilmar. But a crowd that's about to break usually breaks around a fixed point, and Scout had just made himself one, sitting, watching, utterly unbothered by an armed administrator 60 feet away, and 40 frightened workers arranged themselves around that stillness, the way water finds a rock in a current. They didn't run. They didn't approach him either. They just stopped scattering and stood, watching the dog watch the man, and for the first time since Kess's transport had set down, nobody on that ramp was moving except him. Kess noticed. You could see it land on him the way bad news lands, a half-step break in his stride, a glance at the dog he clearly hadn't planned for. He ran his authority on motion, crews scrambling, workers flinching, guards falling in step behind him. He'd built 40 people's fear into a shape he could walk through and rearrange at will. Now there was one small unarmed animal in the middle of it who would not scramble, would not flinch, and the 40 people around it had stopped being afraid in the useful, movable way he needed. He did the thing men like Kess do when a room stops responding the way it's supposed to. He addressed the dog directly, which is its own kind of admission, told it, in coalition trade tongue, to move. Scout's ears flicked at the tone. That's a sound cue, not a comprehension one, and he tilted his head, the exact gesture he'd make at a whistle he didn't recognize. He did not move. He did not need to be brave about it. He simply hadn't been given a reason to. One of the guards took half a step forward, hand drifting toward his sidearm, and I came off the gate fast enough that I heard my own boots on the plating. "He's not going to do anything," I said, and I kept my voice as flat and unhurried as the dog was. "He's sitting. That's all that's happening here." I didn't say it to be brave. I said it because it was true, and because I have spent 6 years learning that the fastest way to make a Corvain guard nervous is to sound nervous back. I walked to Scout's side, put my hand flat on the top of his head the way you'd rest a hand on a fence post, and said, "Stay," which he was already doing, because the word was for the room, not the dog. Nobody drew, nobody moved the crew, and Kess, standing on an open ramp in front of his own guards and 40 workers who were no longer performing fear for him, understood that there was no order he could give that wouldn't look smaller than the thing that had just quietly refused to give him one. You cannot punish a dog for sitting. You cannot threaten a crowd that isn't moving. You cannot walk back to your transport having lost, in full view of everyone, to an animal that never once looked like a threat. So he did the only thing left that preserved anything. He said the inspection was concluded, that the crew would resume quota tomorrow, and he turned and walked back to his transport at a pace that was trying very hard to look unhurried and wasn't quite managing it. The guards followed. Nobody looked back at the dog. I think, in a way, that not looking back was the most honest thing any of them did that day. Sen came by the kennel gate an hour later, once the ramp had gone back to its ordinary noise. He didn't say much. Ilmar don't, especially not gratitude, which they seem to regard as a debt best left unspoken between working people. He crouched down, slow, the way you'd approach any animal you respected and didn't fully understand, and held out one gray, four-fingered hand. Scout sniffed it once, sighed the way old dogs sigh when the interesting part of the day is over, and put his chin down on his own paws in the sun, coming through the ramp's high vents. I filed no incident report, because there was no incident. A crowd stood still. A dog sat down. An administrator remembered a meeting he needed to attend. I've thought since about what would have happened if Scout had been younger, faster, sharper-tempered, if he'd have barked, lunged, given Kess something to point at and call a threat. It would have ended differently, and worse, for everyone standing on that ramp. But he was 11 years old, and slow in the hips, and entirely without the instinct to escalate anything, because that was never what he was built for. He was built to hold a flock together by being the calmest thing in the field, and on a Tuesday on a mining moon with no name I bother to remember, that turned out to be enough to undo a man who had spent years building his whole authority out of other people's fear. I still run the kennel rounds. Scout's retired now, mostly sleeps in the sun by the gate, gets scratched behind the ears by Ilmar crews who make a small, quiet point of stopping to do it. Nobody on Varen's Reach calls him a hero. I don't think he'd know what to do with the word if they did. He just watches the flock, the way he always has, waiting for the one animal in it that's about to do something foolish. And some Tuesdays, that animal wears an administrator's collar instead of wool.